Welcome to module number 6, Releasing the Increment from the PeopleCert Scrum Master I certification training from 1wtraining. This module will have just one question in the exam. It's a small one. Release planning. Release planning is a valuable thing to do when using Scrum but isn't required by Scrum itself, as per the release notes for the Scrum Guide July 2011. Scrum is about the creation of an increment. The Scrum Guide, therefore, does not specifically address release planning nor it address deployment of the release. The release notes for the 2011 update to the Scrum Guide, which is an old update, indicates that the release planning is a valuable thing to do when using Scrum, but isn't required by Scrum itself. Therefore, we are not going into too much detail on this topic, but understand a little bit for reference purposes. Release planning prior to starting sprints remains in the bigger context of Agile. You might remember from the planning onion that we have the release layer as well, before it goes to the sprint layer and then the daily layer. Release planning in Scrum is carried out iteratively, often at the end of the sprints when enough usable functionality is ready to be made available to customers and users. Let us take a look at the link shown below, scrumguides.org, revisions.html, where we can find the changes between the 2010 and the 2011 Scrum Guides. Point number 3, release planning is a valuable thing to do when using Scrum, but isn't required by Scrum itself. That's all we see here in the Scrum Guide. However, we are referring to the 2020 November update of the Scrum Guide, and you can find that also here at this site. Therefore, you may want to go through this as well. Changes between the 2017 and 2020 Scrum Guides. Of course, you will not see anything about release planning there. Next, we look at the concept of release timing. In Scrum, as we have just seen, release planning is carried out iteratively, often in discussion with stakeholders during the sprint review at the end of the sprint, but before the retrospective, or it is based upon a release plan determined as part of a product roadmap. The use of the burn up and burn down charts may be used in forecasting releases, depending on what is completed already and what is yet to be done and what further is foreseen. There are a variety of scenarios an organization might consider for release timing, and we see there the product roadmap factor. Should it be done in every sprint, or it is a continuous delivery? It depends on what the customers need and when do they need it or want it. Which means there are many situations. We could have a pre-established release schedule like once a month, once a quarter, or based on a product roadmap. That's the first shown here. The release determined between the product owner and the business when there is adequate functionality for the product to be usable and useful to the customer. Which means continuous integration and continuous delivery where code may be deployed but not released. Continuous integration from the DevOps culture means where code is integrated continuously, and delivery continuous means the code is built and kept ready for deployment in production or other environments. So continuous deployment is taking continuous delivery further by automating the deployments. So we begin with the continuous integration, then move to continuous delivery capability, and which leads to continuous deployment or automated frequent deployments. However, that is not in scope here for Scrum. Regardless of the approach selected, a release would not be performed during the sprint execution because the customer would first need to see the newly created product increment during the sprint review. There may be several increments within a sprint, but at the end of the sprint, when we have the sprint review, that's when all the increments from the sprint, but commonly one increment, is reviewed. The next point is about every sprint. It is important to consider whether or not customers want releases in every sprint or if this might be too overwhelming. Release planning always needs to be done in conjunction with the needs and wants of the customer, which is why the primarily responsibility lies with the product owner. We already discussed continuous delivery. Therefore, the considerations will be depending on the situation within an organization. The variables that affect release planning. Release planning seeks to determine what constitutes the most valuable next release and what the desired level of quality is. The constraints of scope, date, and budget are important variables in the planning of releases. So we see the three shown here: scope, date, and budget. These variables always play a role in an organization's planning for releases and in determining what level of quality will be expected. You change one of these variables and it will have some impact on the others as well. We pause here for you to make some notes or note down some questions which we want to explore further, or note down how you may contact us. info@1wtraining.com. That is our email ID. There may be fixed scope releases and fixed date releases. So among the three factors, scope, date, and budget, you can see in fixed scope release, scope is important, whereas in the fixed date release, the date is important. The fixed scope release is appropriate when the scope of the project is more important than the date or the budget. Therefore, if time runs out before all the features are completed, then the date and budget are extended. Fixed date release. This is more closely aligned to Scrum principles of time boxing. When time runs out on the project, those features not completed are dropped and moved to the next sprint or iteration. We can fix both the date and budget, but the scope must be flexible as per Kenneth Rubin, author of Essential Scrum. The release backlog. The release backlog, if the organization has a preference for it, it will be a subset of the product backlog, representing those product backlog items completed during a sprint and accepted by the customers or key stakeholders. The product owner is solely responsible for managing the release backlog. Just to be clear here, that the release backlog is a subset of the product backlog completed during a sprint. You might wonder if that is not the sprint backlog. Yes, every sprint at the sprint planning meeting, a sprint backlog would be created with the sprint goal in it. And those items, the PBIs of the sprint backlog, would be delivered at the end of that iteration or sprint. And if that is going into release, then it will also be part of the release backlog. It's possible that the release backlog may have a collection of several sprints rather than just a single sprint. Next, we understand how we move from the product backlog to the release backlog. While we have a series of pictures coming up, I would like to show you a high-level picture first. We have the product backlog first of all, shown on the left. The product backlog includes the product goal, shown at the top there, and it'll include the refined user stories as a result of product backlog refinement and kept ready as clear user stories followed by epics below them, which means that the user stories are clear enough to be included in a sprint backlog. Therefore, in the middle column, we see the sprint backlogs, one after another for every sprint. So if you look at the top section of the middle column, we got the sprint 1 backlog, which will have the sprint 1 goal, and the user stories or the PBI selected for the sprint 1, including their tasks, which should be part of a sprint backlog. And then we have the sprint 2 goal, along with sprint 2 user stories and their tasks as part of the sprint backlog for the second sprint. Similarly, you may have other sprint backlog as well. Together, they make the release backlog, and that's shown in the last on the right, where we have release backlog at the successful end of sprint 1, which will have user story 1, 2, and 3. And we move to the end of the sprint 2, then we will include user story 4, 5, and 6 into the release backlog at the end of sprint 2. Therefore, while we have user story 1, 2, and 3 only in the release backlog at the end of sprint 1, we will have not only 1, 2, and 3, but also 4, 5, 6 in the release backlog at the end of sprint 2.